Looking back on your nearly 4 years in Cyprus, what personal reflections are you taking with you? Was there a defining moment that captured your time here, either diplomatically or personally?
I would say not a specific moment, but certainly one of the things that impacted me the most was the interactions with ordinary Cypriots, civil society, people who would like to see a better future for Cyprus. And I was just very taken by the commitment of people who, some of whom have spent their entire lives as activists or as, community members and have never given up hope. And whenever I meet with people like this, I find it, it really, it re-inspires me and gives me a lot of motivation because, of course, there's a lot of challenges in Cyprus, a lot of obstacles to a solution. So it's really encouraging to have had the opportunity to meet, get to know, become friends with so many people who really are committed to a better future for Cyprus.
On a side note, do you find that most of the people committed to this peace process, are they of a certain generation?
Well, certainly there are people of an older generation who are committed, but I'm very impressed by the role of young people. I mean, young people have grown up without necessarily the baggage of their parents and grandparents, and so while they may not feel the same, let's say, urgency on the issue, they remain open. And we've seen examples of this with the Technical Committee on Youth, for example, how some of them who had not really been much involved in bicommunal work before have become quite enthusiastic. So I personally think that there's a huge potential for the younger generation to make up their own minds rather than believing what they might have been told, and create new opportunities for a settlement in Cyprus.
So where does the Cyprus reunification process stand now as you hand things over? Is the situation today more conducive towards a bizonal, bicommunal federation, or are we quietly shifting away from that model? Because until recently, the property issue in Varosha, Morphu, and the guarantees on the table. I mean, today we're talking about checkpoints in New York. The last meeting was an argument about checkpoints. There were minute details, it seems. I mean, what does that shift say about the health of the process right now?
I mean, you referred to sort of a recent consensus. That was 8 years ago, the last negotiations, 2017. That's quite a while. And since then, there hasn't been any progress on the Cyprus issue. In fact, the parties have taken quite distant positions. When I arrived in late 2021, the parties were very far apart and there was no real dialogue that was happening. I think we're in a better position today, but I think we have to recognize that this is going to be a gradual step-by-step process, at least under the current circumstances. The parties remain very, very far apart on what a settlement might be. And well, I understand people's impatience to, get on with it, get back to the table, solve the Cyprus problem. We have to get there before we can actually start that work. In other words, I've used the analogy before, we have to walk to the mountain before we can start climbing the mountain. And dealing with the Cyprus issue is a mountain. It's quite a complex issue, but we're not even there yet. We're not even talking about the Cyprus issue because of the difference between the sides. So what we're doing in the meantime is taking steps that can lead us in that direction towards a settlement. And everybody agrees, everybody who is involved in these talks agrees that that's what we're doing. We're trying to move towards a situation where we can have a settlement.
So you're saying that when you first started, the two sides were really far apart. Now that you're leaving, you feel that they're closer?
No, the positions have
Still,
not changed.
They haven't changed.
But we have certainly a lot more going on today than we did in 2021. We've had a personal envoy appointed who's now beginning a second term. The Secretary General has convened now 3 different meetings with the leaders on the one hand in New York and the broader format a couple of this year, and they've agreed to more meetings coming up. So we have a continuity of engagement at the moment that we haven't seen really in the last 8 years. So from that perspective, you know, step by step, we're in a better position than we have been. But we're still obviously, you know, going in an incremental way until we can get a consensus on discussing the actual issue. And I think this is necessary. It's not that we're diverting attention away from the Cyprus issue, but in the absence of being able to actually get agreement to talk about it, these types of measures are important steps to kind of build a bit of momentum, build a bit of confidence, and address the question of trust, which is really a key issue in the Cyprus issue.
So are the CBMs helping, the confidence building measures? Are they helping in general?
Well, yes, they have created a sense of momentum since the March meeting, where 6 trust-building initiatives were agreed. The work was, you know, work advanced. We went into the July meeting with 4 of them accomplished and significant discussion on a 5th. So each time an agreement is reached, it creates a little bit more momentum, a little bit more positivity, a little bit more space. And the whole goal is to get back to some kind of discussion that could lead to a settlement on the Cyprus issue. Absolutely.
So just, in your opinion, are the confidence-building measures the most important thing in trying to get this to the solution?
No, they're not the most important thing. They are a means to an end.
But they bring both sides together.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget that the sides meet regularly anyway. I myself convene almost weekly a meeting between the 2 negotiators. You've seen a number of times when I've brought the leaders together at their request, both socially and for substantive talks. We have 13 now technical committees where very senior people from the 2 sides meet on a regular basis to solve problems and come up with initiatives. So there's a lot of interaction happening. And the confidence-building measures, the trust-building initiatives that are being worked on under the leadership of the Secretary General are steps in the direction that we want to go. It's not that they, in and of themselves, are so crucial, but they're important steps along that path.
Well, we appreciate the steps that you're trying to encourage both sides to take on. But what is your opinion about recently when a Turkish Cypriot group tried to offer help for the fires, the wildfires, and it was rejected by our government?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I think we have to recognize that when there are natural disasters, there is solidarity among Cypriot people. We've seen this in many cases in the past. And but one of the fundamental issues in the Cyprus issue is a lack of trust, and it isn't so much between ordinary Cypriots. Millions of people cross the crossing points every year, and it's almost unheard of that there's any type of incident. Cypriots themselves might have different opinions, but there isn't that problem. The problem occurs at the level of the bureaucracies and the political leadership, where there is really immense distrust. There's a lot of baggage that's carried from past perceived grievances. And I think this is really one of the fundamental problems in the Cyprus issue. Each side has its own one-sided historic narrative. And these narratives are kind of repeated in an echo chamber and disseminated through education, through media, through public positions of the government. And it's really unhelpful because they're not intersecting, they're not interacting. These various narratives don't confront each other. And I think that that's really one of the main obstacles, because it creates this sense that we are absolutely right and the other side is absolutely wrong. And under those circumstances, the leaders say, well, how can I compromise on anything? How can I concede the slightest thing? And so we're left with a situation where all of this effort is being done, from the Secretary General through the personal envoy, through all the work of the teams here on the ground, and the entire international community for that matter, and many Cypriots are making these huge efforts to try to somehow bring the parties back to the table and solve the Cyprus issue. And that work is working against all odds, because the leaders are incapable of making the compromises necessary, whether it's on small trust-building initiatives or on the whole Cyprus problem. And that, I think, stems from this, sort of self-perpetuating narratives that are very narrow and very self-serving, and create, as I say, this sense of right and wrong. If the two sides, and this is not just applicable to Cyprus, but I think it's true anywhere in the world where there's a conflict. If the two sides cannot acknowledge the legitimate suffering of the other side, then it's very difficult to have a respectful conversation about the future. Think of Israel-Palestine. It's the same thing here in Cyprus. If you're caught up in this historical narrative that we were, the victims of an injustice, and certainly there's very good reasons to feel that way. But that's not the whole story. The other side also has suffered injustices and has lost people and has lost property, and there's a need for people to say, look, it's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about how do we forge a future together going forward. And letting go of some of this sense of, we're absolutely right and they're absolutely wrong is I think, a necessary part of the way forward.
That's a great point. So we see this, though, across the communities, the young people. They're not as bothered about the island's division, it seems. I've noticed it. More Turkish Cypriot cars visiting the Republic. And of course, we've always had a lot of people going up the occupied north. But some people think that the Cyprus problem now is quietly settling itself. It's been 51 years.
Yeah.
And it seems, the president is saying we can't accept the status quo. And then we have Turkish Cypriot leader Tatar saying, well, we can't accept, we have to be recognized as a state. After 51 years, and Turkish Cypriots being born on land owned by the Greek Cypriots, how?
And vice versa, by the way.
And vice versa, yes, exactly. And Turkish Cypriots here.
Turkish Cypriots lost
exactly.
a lot of property.
Yes. Yeah. So do you think it's settling itself in a way?
So I think the one thing that there's a consensus on is that the status quo is not acceptable. I know what you're saying, that some people are resigned to, well, this isn't going to be solved and things will just stay the way they are. I think that's a huge mistake, because there is no status quo that is dependable. And, in a broader sense, just look around the world at what we used to take for granted, about frozen conflicts and so forth. On this point, I agree with Mr. Christo. The status quo is not something that is staying the same. What is happening is the North is becoming more and more dependent on Turkey, more and more integrated politically and economically with Turkey. And as that happens, the chance of any sort of reunification fades. So, as we sit here, the status quo is not remaining the same. And if nothing changes, what is going to happen is the thing that Greek Cypriots fear most, and they're going to end up with a Turkish border running through the island. Okay. So that alone, I think, is a very good argument for putting all of our efforts into trying to resolve the Cyprus problem in a mutually acceptable way. The status quo is not an option. It's either things continue in the direction that they're going and the north becomes gradually absorbed into Turkey, or a negotiated agreement that comes up with something else. Now, as you know, the Security Council has adopted BBF as the solution. But at the moment, the reality is that there's no consensus between the two sides. As a mediator, the United Nations has to speak respectfully to both sides and try to help find some solution that they can both live with. And that has not changed. We have to deal with the reality and not, not some preconceived notion as to what the solution will be, because there can end up being no solution, in which case the evolution will go in the direction that I mentioned.
Okay. The UN peacekeeping force here in Cyprus has prevented, it's the reason that not a lot of tensions have occurred between the both sides. Is it enough for them to make a difference here, continuing on, or will their role change? Will it have to evolve if you continue on being on this island, let's say, if no solution is found yet?
Well, I understand people's frustration with the lack of a solution to the Cyprus problem. It's been 61 years. Last year we marked 60 years in Cyprus. And some people, again, getting back to these historic narratives, some people forget that the mission was mandated here by the UN Security Council in 1964, not 1974, because of intercommunal violence that continued throughout that decade. The peacekeeping mission is serving a purpose. There has been no fighting between the sides in 51 years. That in and of itself is something that I think people can be thankful of. And on a practical basis, what we are doing every day is, as you pointed out, conflict prevention, because there are dozens of incidents, most of them minor, but every one of which has the potential, if it's not addressed, to escalate. And it's a small place. Things escalate very quickly. It doesn't take many minutes between an incident in the buffer zone and a phone call that I get from a political leader. Things that escalate very quickly can turn into political tensions, which can then impact the possibility of a settlement. So aside from preventing fighting, what the peacekeeping mission is doing is helping create conditions so that a political settlement can be found. We have also a special political mission, which is here, called the Good Offices Mission, which is a separate mission from the peacekeeping mission, but it's all under one sort of UN umbrella here. I lead both efforts on the ground. And both of those missions, the entire purpose of the UN here is to help create conditions so that the Cyprus issue can be resolved, and then we can leave. I mean, that's the ultimate goal of a peacekeeping mission, is to be able to leave. But you don't want to do that precipitously, and unfortunately, if the UN were to want to leave before there was a solution, because of the distrust which I mentioned earlier, both sides, I fear, would resume conflict, not because they want to, but because they distrust the other side, and they fear that the other side would take advantage of any vacuum, and therefore they would be compelled to preempt the other side doing something. And if they're both thinking this at the same time, then they're compelled to kind of enter into conflict, even though they wouldn't want to. I mean, I have seen nothing in my time here that suggests that on either side there's the slightest desire or intention to have any conflict. But that doesn't mean that the peacekeeping mission can just quietly leave because of this distrust. The UN continues to play a vital role. You know, when I was in New York a few weeks ago, one of the diplomats that I deal with gave this analogy, which I think is very telling. You know, if you're having problems with your heart and a cardiologist implants a pacemaker to solve things, then they come back a few years later and they say, you know, everything's going very well. We're going to take the pacemaker out now. That's not how it works. If everything's going very well, because the pacemaker is doing its job, you leave it in to continue doing its job. And that's a good analogy for the peacekeeping mission, I would say.
That's a good point. Okay, finally, my last question for you, and in relation to what we just discussed, there was a little incident, or there was a major incident in the Green Line with the refugees. And there was some sort of tension between you and President Loulides because you were trying to get the government to accept them to cross over on humanitarian grounds as well.
I think the issue has been misunderstood. So the United Nations stands for human rights everywhere in the world. There are people all around the world fleeing conflict, fleeing persecution, fleeing legitimate threats to their lives and so forth. And therefore, there are international agreements which say that any state that has refugees arriving has an obligation to first and foremost assess what the claim. If somebody says, I am fleeing persecution, you're not allowed, according to international human rights law, to push them back without first doing an assessment of whether that's valid or not. And if you determine that it's valid, then you certainly can't push them back to their deaths, right? So there is an international responsibility to assess the claims of anybody who says that they are fleeing a life-threatening situation. Here on the island, Greek Cypriots would certainly agree that the only legitimate state, the only recognized state, is the Republic of Cyprus. Therefore, if somebody shows up in the territory that is controlled by the state of Republic of Cyprus, they have an obligation to process those people. And the buffer zone is under the authority of the United Nations, but it's not a legal no man's land. As far as the Republic of Cyprus is concerned, its laws apply in the buffer zone as well. So when refugees arrive in the buffer zone, we are duty-bound to present them to the legitimate authority of the Republic of Cyprus for them to fulfill their obligations. Now, you know, the Republic of Cyprus had its own way of handling this. They were not processing these claims, and these people in the buffer zone, you know, did not voluntarily camp in the buffer zone. They were physically pushed back into the buffer zone, and we had a very difficult situation where for 6 months we had to provide food, water, shelter, everything for these people. Very little assistance from the Republic of Cyprus, I must say. And so, yes, we had a very serious difference of opinion, not between UNFICYP and the government, but between the UN and the government about how these cases must be handled. And in the end, they were accepted and they were processed as is their international obligation. So we went through a very unfortunate period where people, you can imagine the conditions, living in a tent in the summer here, young people, old people, people with vulnerabilities and so forth, were kept in those conditions, terrible conditions, for a very long time. So it's about, you know, it's about international human rights norms, and it's about international obligations. And our role in it was just simply dealing with the fallout, really.
Any final statements now that you're leaving?
Well, I think the Cyprus problem, the Cyprus issue is solvable. I'm very much encouraged by ordinary Cypriots who would like to see it solved. We've done public opinion polling that shows that a majority of both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots would like to see the Cyprus issue solved with a mutually agreeable agreement. The one common area that everybody seems to agree with is a BBF solution. And so, this is what the people want. And it's disappointing that the leaders are not able to overcome their own internal obstacles to actually sit down and solve the Cyprus problem once and for all. It's solvable. It really should be solved, but it's hard for me to say whether it ever will be solved.
Thank you. Thank you very much.